welcome to the second Crochet Friday in the month of October. So as we did last week, today we're going to be learning another Tunisian crochet pattern, or you could call it a texture, but just a simple design that you can incorporate into other Tunisian crochet projects. And today's design is diagonal stripes. For this pattern, all you need to know is how to do the knit stitch and the purl stitch in Tunisian crochet. I'm going to walk you through the pattern, and then once we're familiar with it, I'm going to show how you can make some variations to make your stripes wider or shorter. This green yarn and also this pink yarn that I'm going to be using are both Karen's Simply Soft yarn. I really like this yarn. It feels so nice once it's worked up. As a quick note though, I will say this yarn is very bad about splitting, and splitting just means when you're working and instead of going around the yarn, sometimes the little fibers in the ply of the yarn get separated and you end up splitting the yarn by going through the fibers between the ply. But despite the tendency to split, I do still really like this yarn, and it does turn out very nice. So I've got my yarn, and then I'm going to be using a Tunisian crochet hook. This is one of my ones from my Denise interchangeable hook set. Absolutely love these things. I probably won't extend it today. We'll see, I might need to extend it. But I'm using a size J 6mm crochet hook. All right, let's learn how to crochet the Tunisian crochet diagonal stripes pattern. As with most projects, we're going to start with a slip knot. And then we're going to need to work a chain, and then we'll complete a foundation row. So I'm going to chain a multiple of 3. In my case, I'm going to do 9 chains. You can do more or less chains, just make sure it is a multiple of 3. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And I probably should have gone up a hook size for my chain, but I didn't, so we're just gonna keep going with it. Now I'm gonna start on my foundation row, where I'm gonna pick up a total of 9 loops. We've already got 1 loop on our hook, so we don't need to pick anything up from our first stitch. But we're gonna go to the second stitch, and I like to pick up from the back loop when I'm working Tunisian crochet. Just yarn over and pick up a loop. Get my third loop here and go all the way down. And if you're not familiar with starting a Tunisian crochet project, I'll link to a video that can get you started there. So now I've worked the forward pass of my foundation row, so I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 loops on my hook. Then to finish this off, we're just gonna work the standard Tunisian crochet return pass, where we yarn over, pull through 1 loop, and then the rest of the way across, we're gonna yarn over, pull through 2 loops, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2, and keep doing that until we have just 1 loop left on our hook. So now it's time for row 1. And the way this pattern works is we're going to do 3 knit stitches, 3 purl stitches, and then 3 knit stitches. Then on the next row, we're going to shift everything to the right 1 stitch. So then we'll do 2 knit stitches, 3 purl stitches, 3 knit stitches, and then 1 knit stitch. Next row, we'll shift it over to the right again, and we'll keep repeating this process. But for our first row, we're going to start by working 3 knit stitches. This loop on our hook is going to count as the first stitch of this row, so we're going to let that count as our first knit stitch. Then I'm going to go to my second stitch and work a knit stitch, where you go between the vertical bars out the back, yarn over, and pull up a loop. So we're going to count that as 2 knit stitches, and then a third knit stitch right here. And then we're going to do 3 purl stitches. So the purl stitch, I like to kind of yarn over in the reverse direction, insert my hook under the vertical bar, and then bring it back to the front, and then do my yarn over. I find doing that little kind of backwards yarn over is the easiest way to get it out of my way. But the knit stitch is just where you keep the tail of yarn to the front, go under the vertical bar of your next stitch, and then do a yarn over and pull up a loop like normal. Personally, I like doing it where I yarn over backwards, because it just makes it easier to keep that yarn tail to the front and out of the way. But that is my third purl stitch, and then we're going to go to working 3 knit stitches in the last 3 stitches. So right here, we're going to go work a knit stitch, go to my next spot, work a knit stitch, and in my last stitch, work a knit stitch. And I like to come under both of those bars on my very last stitch, because I think it just gives a nicer edge to my projects. Fortunately, all the return passes in this pattern are just the standard Tunisian return pass, where we yarn over and pull through 1, then yarn over, pull through 2, all the way until we have 1 loop left on our hook. So now it's time for the forward pass of row 2. We're essentially going to shift our pattern 1 stitch to the right. So instead of starting with 3 knit stitches, we're going to start with just 2. This first loop on our hook is going to count as our first knit stitch. So I'm going to go to my second stitch and work a knit stitch. And then I'm going to work 3 purl stitches. So again, I like to do it where I yarn over backwards first, insert under that vertical bar, and then yarn over like normal to work your first purl stitch, then a second one, and then a third purl stitch. Then we're going to go back to doing 3 knit stitches. So in this next stitch, work a knit stitch, work a second knit stitch, and a third knit stitch. And then in our very last stitch, we're going to work a purl stitch. And even if I'm working a purl stitch, I still like to come under both of these bars here on the end because I think it just gives a neater edge to the left side of my project. But I've got my yarn tail to the front, so now we're going to yarn over and pull up a loop to work that 1 knit stitch, and then work a standard Tunisian crochet return pass. Row 3, we're again going to essentially shift our pattern 1 stitch to the right. So the previous row we started with 2 knit stitches, this time we're going to start with 1 knit stitch, and this loop on our hook is going to count as our 1 knit stitch. Now it's time to do 3 purl stitches. So I'm going to go to my second stitch of the row, and work a purl stitch, work a second purl stitch in the next stitch, and then a third purl stitch. Next, we're going to work 3 knit stitches. So this is our first knit stitch, our second knit stitch, and a third knit stitch. And then the last 2 stitches, we're going to work a purl stitch. So we're going to work 1 purl stitch, and then 2 purl stitches. And then once more, we're going to work the standard Tunisian crochet return pass. Now for row 4, again, our pattern is going to shift 1 stitch to the right. So last time we started with a single knit stitch. This time we're going to start with 3 purl stitches. So again, loop on our hook counts as our first stitch. So then in our next stitch, we're going to work our second purl stitch. So that counts as 2, and then 3. Next 3 stitches are going to all be knit stitch. So 1, 2, and 3. And then in our last 3 stitches, we're going to work a purl stitch in each one of those. 1, 2, and in our last one, for 3. Again, standard return pass. So by now you're probably noticing the pattern that's taking place, that we're just shifting our pattern over 1. We work 3 of the same stitch, swap to 3 of the same stitch, and we just keep shifting it over 1. So last time we started with 3 purl stitches, this time we're going to start with just 2 purl stitches. This loop counts as our first stitch, and then in our next stitch we're going to work a purl stitch. Now it's time for 3 knit stitches. Another way to know that you're ready to swap to the next one is this next stitch here is a purl stitch from the previous row, and then we have 1, 2, 3 knit stitches. So in the last knit stitch of any section, we want to work purl stitches. So we'll work a purl stitch there, and then 2, 3. And then this is the last knit stitch of the previous row. So in the last knit stitch, we always work a purl stitch, and then that's the first one, and then we work 2 more for a total of 3, and then we just keep swapping back and forth like that. So in our previous row, this is our last purl stitch, so it means it's time to work a knit stitch in this spot and in the next 2 stitches. So that's 1, that's 2, and that's 3. Then we just have 1 knit stitch left from the previous row, so that means it's time to work 3 purl stitches. So a purl stitch in that last knit stitch, a second purl stitch, if I make sure I do the right stitch, and then a third purl stitch. And then now that I've worked 3 purl stitches, it's time to swap back to knit stitch. So in this last stitch here, I'm going to work a knit stitch. And then standard Tunisian return pass. Now it's time for the next row. You may end up getting to a point where you're like, wait, what did I start with? Did I start with knit stitches? Did I start with purl stitches? If you can't remember what you started with, just remember that in the last stitch of a section, you work a different kind of stitch. So here in this previous row, we have 2 purl stitches. So that means this first stitch is going to be a purl stitch also, but then the next stitch is going to be a knit stitch because it's the last purl stitch of this purl stitch section. So this comes as our purl stitch, and now it's time to work a knit stitch. And we're going to work 3 of those. So 1, 2, and 3. Once we do 3 knits, we go back to doing 3 purl stitches. So 1, 2, and 3. Once we work 3 purl stitches, we're going to work 3 knit stitches. And if you're getting to the end of the row, obviously you'll just work in however many stitches you have left. So this time we're just going to do 1 knit stitch, and then 2 knit stitches. And again, standard return pass. And now guess what? We've reached the point where our pattern repeats. Probably saw the pattern emerging where we just work 3 of a stitch and then 3 of the other stitch bouncing back and forth. And just every time it's like our stitches are shifted over to the right one. But that is how you work the Tunisian Crochet Diagonal Stripe pattern. I'll work this up a little bit more so you can see the pattern really appear. So here is the little swatch I was working on. This is what it looks like after doing a lot more rows and just repeating that process and that pattern for however long I want my project to be. So before I wrap up the video, I'm gonna just kind of talk you through a couple of different things. So first of all, as I showed in last week's video, it's really fun with these textures if you play around with different yarn weights, and different hook sizes. So this is working with a smaller hook and a finer yarn. And then here's what it looks like working with a larger hook and about the same weight yarn. It just kind of makes it a little bulkier, and you use a hook that's a little bit larger than your yarn, it'll make it a little more elastic and stretchy, whereas this is a lot more dense. So I always find it really fun to play around with different yarns and hook sizes, because even if you're doing the same stitches and patterns, different yarns can create totally different visual effects, and it's a lot of fun discovering all the different possibilities. One last thing that I will mention is how to adapt this pattern if you want to make your stripes wider. So hopefully as we went through working our little pink swatch here, you kind of got the feel for how the pattern works. But the basic idea to adjust this is you're gonna pick how many stitches you want each stripe to be. So this one, I did each stripe just 3 stitches wide, but with this larger one, I made my stripes be 4 stitches wide. So you could do 2, you could do 3, you could do 10 if you wanted really wide stripes as well. So here's how you adjust the pattern if you're doing wider stripes. Let's say you're doing 5 stitches wide for each stripe instead of 3 like we did here. In that case, you're going to essentially have 10 different rows that you'll then repeat. And the way you know it would be 10 rows that repeat is because you have 5 for this stripe and 5 for this stripe. In this case, we have 6 rows that repeat, and that's because we have 3 stitches for the first stripe and 3 stitches for the second stripe. So for example, you might do 5 purl stitches, 5 knit stitches, 5 purl stitches, however wide you want your project to be. That's for row 1. Then for row 2, you're going to do 1 less of the stitch that you started with. So if we started with 5 purl, then we're going to start with 4 purl stitches, and in the 5th purl stitch from the last row, we're going to swap over to doing knit stitches, and then we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 knit stitches, and that'll bring us to the last row of knit stitches from the previous row. We'll swap back to doing 5 stitches of purl. Hopefully that kind of makes sense the way I'm saying it. I know it's a lot of words, but hopefully watching it kind of makes a little bit of sense what I'm saying. And essentially the idea is we're shifting the pattern over by 1 stitch every single row. And because each of our stripes are 5 stitches wide, there will be 10 rows that repeat, 10 different variations until we shift back and end up where we started, basically. Okay, so that was the last thing. I do have one more thing to show you. And this is another variation on this diagonal stripe pattern. And all this one does that's different from what we worked today is instead of doing knit stitches and purl stitches, this one uses knit stitches and then simple stitch stitches. So if you want to add even more variation to this, you can use any 2 Tunisian stitches that you want. You could do knit stitch and simple stitch. You could do knit stitch and purl like I showed in the video. You could do simple stitch, and purl stitches, and each of those combinations will create different textures, different definitions to the stripes. Personally, I really like doing the knit and purl stitches. I personally like the looks of those stripes best, but if you do the knit paired with a simple stitch, that's another look. You still get the stripes, and it's just kind of a different, funky, fun look. But that's how you can work this really simple but also really beautiful Tunisian crochet diagonal stripes pattern. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure to let me know if you liked it by leaving a thumbs up on the video and commenting down below. If you have a project that you saw this pattern and were like, oh, I have to use this to make whatever, definitely let me know in the comments what you're going to make. I always love hearing what everyone's working on, and it always inspires me to try new stuff too. And if you're not a subscriber, I'd really appreciate it if you also hit the subscribe button while you're here. But don't forget to check out last week's Crochet Friday, and make sure you come back next Friday for another Tunisian texture. I will see you in my next video, and until then, happy crafting!